Hello everyone and welcome back to another Sims 4 Speed video. So today we're going to be creating a very gothic mansion in The Sims 4, and we're actually building within Forgotten Hollow, if I remember that world name correctly, which came with the Vampires game pack. And I'm super excited to show this build to you guys because it's just something new and unique to the channel, and especially since it's pretty much Halloween, I wanted to create something that was kind of like on theme with that trend and vibe. So yeah, we're starting off with this very unique shape right in the center of the lot. And in case you guys are wondering, we're building this on a 40 by 30 lot on the tallest sort of area in the world, and I just kind of went with like what I thought would look interesting and intriguing for a gothic mansion, because I don't really tend to create in this style, so it's kind of like nice, new and refreshing for me as well. But yeah, just tried to come up with something that looked relatively interesting, and I ended up placing this entire build on top of a foundation. I just personally love the elevation they gave to this build, just like trying to make it feel really tall and like kind of gargantuan, to be honest, especially since it's kind of like having like a strong emphasis on like a scary sort of like spooky mansion. I feel like that will kind of resemble something that looks relatively tall, or just like something that looks super spooky in general. And I feel like this definitely got the vibe across that I tried to get, that I had in my mind. And we are also incorporating a few curved pieces here and there, mainly on the exterior, to make the actual shaping look as visually appealing as possible. But we do have some towers here and there that are within the main build itself as well, and I just really love how they come together and just like are very incorporated nicely throughout the entire build, so they're not really buggy or anything like that, and they don't really consist of like the main living space gameplay, so it's not really that big of a deal if like you guys don't really like rounded rooms and stuff. I feel like it definitely gave the overall structure such an interesting look and feel to this build overall. And despite the build not being relatively huge, I still really love how it turned out, especially since like I pretty much used up all of the space that we have on the lot to make it look as interesting as possible. Initially I was actually going to go with the castle pieces because I wanted to create some sort of like gothic tall castle vibe, but like at the same time I also wanted to create some sort of like haunted mansion type vibe with like these peaked gabled roofs and stuff like that. So that was kind of like the end result of what I went with. So it's kind of like a mixture of both, because we do end up using a few Victorian style window pieces and stuff like that, but there's some gothic version of ones as well. So yeah, just like incorporating a bunch of different elements of that medieval sort of like traditional vibe into this build, and I'm super happy with how it turned out. And we also have like this small little front porch area where we end up decorating with like a few little pumpkins and stuff like that here and there, just like trying to stay on theme. And you might have noticed that we have this huge sort of like single story box on one side of the build, and that was initially meant to be like a huge glass house area featuring all of like the greenery and pottery and stuff like that, but I ended up changing that and we instead go with an indoor pool design. And I thought that was such a great idea, especially since I love incorporating a lot of swimming pools into my builds, and the best way I could have done it within this one in particular is just by like creating like an indoor one, especially since we don't really have a lot of external space, if that makes sense. But yeah, so right now we're just trying to get these small details down throughout the exterior of the build, such as adding these really tall peaked circular roof pieces, these gabled roof pieces, along with these nice little gargoyles scattered across the roofing areas, as well as like certain parts of the terraces and stuff like that. I feel like it definitely gave a nice unique addition to this build and like trying to make it feel as spooky as possible. And yeah, also ended up using some of these nice black concrete balustrades along certain areas of the balconies, and I really love the overall look of them. It just fits the vibe that I was trying to go for, and it came in such a dark charcoal color to the point where I was able to utilize a sort of like ashy grey sort of color for the actual wallpaper, and it actually contrasted super nicely together despite all being relatively dark colors. And yeah, I'm just super happy with the overall result of it, especially with all this intricate roofing piece that we have going on. It definitely adds a bit of complexity to the build overall, despite it being made up of like quite a few relatively like simple shapes. It just makes it feel like super busy and complex and just like bigger than it already is. And in case you guys are wondering, I ended up going for the tallest wall height for both of the floors, mainly because it just gave that really tall height variation and element that I was trying to go for. And with the other wall heights, it just wasn't really looking, it kind of just like looked like a regular house, to be honest, and that was definitely not what I was trying to go for this build in particular. But yeah, so for the main exterior wallpaper, we end up going for this black sort of like grayish tiling, but it's kind of like a muted gray color to the point where you're able to contrast it with other darker elements throughout all of the structure, such as like the friezes that go around certain parts of the rooms and buildings, along with like the fences themselves. It just definitely me makes it pop and stand out a lot more, rather than just like using like a really solid black color for the wallpaper. It definitely helped with like getting that sort of like spooky mansion vibe across. And yeah, right now I'm just like trying to layer a bunch of different windows that I thought fit the theme of this build in particular. As I mentioned like a few moments ago, just like something that resembled that Gothic sort of style and theme. I did end up using a few things from that castle kit, which came out like I believe it was like a year ago or something like that by now. And we do also end up using quite a lot of the objects that came from the vampire pack as well. So yeah, just like a few mixtures of all of those mixed together within this build in particular, because they all kind of just like work super nicely when they're all like built together, if that makes sense. And for the main flooring that we have for the balcony area, it does actually stay like this for a while, where we have this like white marble grayish texture, but that does actually end up changing to a completely different like sort of darker sort of like grayish color, and it ends up working out so much more nicer with the rest of the build. But we'll end up changing that as we progress throughout the speed build. But yeah, so we also ended up using some of these nice looking Gothic doors for the front entrance of the build, along with incorporating some of these smaller window pieces around the circular rooms themselves. And the circular rooms mainly consist of either they're like bathrooms or just like a small little hangout area. I do remember the one that we have on the second floor is pretty much like a nice small little hangout space with a library, along with a little like seating area and an easel. So it's nothing too special. And the main reason why I just wanted to incorporate those kind of stuff in those smaller circular rooms is because I know a lot of people don't really love these circular rooms in the Sims 4, especially since they can be a bit buggy. But thankfully, while I was building within this build itself, I didn't really experience a lot of issues, so I'm super happy with that. And I hope you guys don't really end up having any issues like that either. But yeah, so for the front area of the home, where we have that huge half circle area, we actually house the living space in there, but the main circular area houses this nice little piano that looks out from the actual view of the build. And I actually really love the overall combination of all of these windows with the addition of those floor to ceiling windows as well. So I wanted to go for those floor to ceiling windows off to the side because I was actually inspired by one specific image that I had seen on Pinterest, and I was like, you know what, that's like a nice incorporation to add within this build. And if you guys have been a member of the channel now, you guys probably know that I love incorporating some traditional and modern designs together, and I feel like I was definitely able to incorporate a few modern pieces here and there throughout the entire build, but obviously mainly focusing on that traditional vibe and aesthetic. And I also found these greenhouse looking worn down windows, which I believe are the ones that came from the Life and Death expansion pack. That is actually another expansion pack that is kind of prominently featured throughout this entire speed build, mainly because it's literally based on Life and Death, and I feel like this build is perfect for that scenario and theme. And it was kind of just like really ongoing, especially once we move on into the kitchen area, which I was super happy about. But yeah, so we do end up changing some of the roofing textures as well to be this more darkish, very contrasty looking tiling design for the roof texture itself. And I love the overall result of it, especially since it just works with the rest of the color scheme that we have going on, and it doesn't look too dark to the point where it's contrasting too much with the rest of the build. It just matches very effortlessly with the rest of the color swatches that we have. And since this is a relatively like Gothic-y Victorian style mansion, I wanted to incorporate some of those olden element and vibes, such as incorporating a nice simple like high leveled gateway throughout the entire build overall. So we pretty much surround the entire lot with this iron fencing. And I love the overall look of it, especially since it's not something that I typically tend to build or create with in my usual builds, because I feel like a very tall fence around the build just makes it feel very privated and just like not very like, I don't know, there's just something about these like really tall fences that feel very generic to me around the entire lot. But when it comes to a build like this, I feel like it definitely does work a lot nicer. So I guess it just depends on what kind of build you're going for, to be honest. And I also really love the creativity and the idea of me placing these sort of like custom column pieces and then placing the gargoyle in the center of them. So they're pretty much half walls, and I just like raised up the platform within them, and I placed a gargoyle right in the center. And I feel like that's like a really creative idea of like trying to create something that looks unique and interesting for this build in particular. And yet we just end up adding a few little foliage pieces here and there. If I were to obviously play within the build itself, I probably would change it to like an autumn theme and just like see all of those color changes for all the leaves and stuff like that. I feel like it definitely would add a nice little gameplay experience if you guys do plan on building and playing with this build in general. But yeah, so we also ended up adding a small little pathway towards the entrance of the build, just like a small little curved one, because we do actually have these stairs on one side of the build rather than having it right straight in the center of where we have that little empty entrance area. I just feel like it made a lot more sense to just like add a bit more difference and variation to this build rather than keeping to the normal of like having everything look very generic. And we do actually end up using quite a lot of decorative furniture pieces that resemble the Halloween theme. So we do actually have quite a lot of pumpkins scattered across this entire build overall, along with like some custom ones as well as like some nice little light fixtured ones. But the main ones that I do end up going for are the ones that sort of just like resemble a generic pumpkin, and I pretty much layered it throughout the entire build because I feel like it fits so nicely with the rest of the build that we had going on. And of course, just use some small little orange bush shrubs and hedges here and there, and I tried to make it feel as interesting and Halloweeny as possible just by like trying to create this unique design of just like incorporating some leaves and like a bunch of different like piled leaves as well as like some small little like branches and stuff like that, which I feel like definitely made this build come together and alive very nicely. And I don't know where these little back objects came from in particular, but I ended up raising them up and like placing them throughout each of the corners of the house, and I feel like it definitely gave it a bit more of a spooky sort of effect, especially with all of those small little bats just like placed along the entire build. It definitely just makes it feel a little bit more Gothic and fits the theme that I was trying to go for. And I felt like the entrance of the build felt relatively empty, to the point where I just decided to add a small little fountain area, and I decided to surround it with some small little rocks and pebbles that sort of had this orangey grayish texture, because I feel like it definitely matched the rest of the color scheme that we had going across the entire build. And I also ended up sizing up some of these smaller pumpkins, and I pretty much just like placed them on top of the rock themselves as if they're like placed on top of it, which I thought was also like a nice small little creative feature. Right next to where we have the fountain itself as well as the pond, it is just like a small little area where we just like incorporate some nice unique features that make this build feel a little bit more complete when it comes to the exterior. But yeah, so we're finally moving on into the interior now, and I pretty much laid out the entire floor plan and the wallpapers and stuff like that, and you guys could pretty much get a nice gist of like what I was trying to go for when it came to the interior. Just like use this very nice paneled wallpaper that had this nice simple black/grayish color to it, and I really love the overall look and feel of that wallpaper in particular. It just feels super gothicy, but at the same time just like very formal and modern. I feel like it is a very versatile wallpaper when it comes to building a Gothic home like this, and I tried to make the tiling on the flooring look as interesting and appealing as possible. So the entrance area, we have this nice little outlined red sort of like design themed area, along with like using these very nice minimalistic looking grayish black tiles around the entire build overall, and I feel like it definitely did carry that Victorian vibe that I was trying to go for. And I did also end up using some of the chandeliers that came from the Life and Death expansion pack as well, because I feel like they felt super fitting with how huge they were, and especially since we had that tallest wall height, it really made sense to just like use a lot of different curtain pieces and variations that were like really tall to make it look as interesting and as appealing as possible, because I feel like I wanted this build to feel super intimidating and just like really unique to look at, that doesn't really resemble a generic family home. And I feel like I was definitely able to get that across, especially with the specific objects I ended up selecting throughout the entire build. I tried to pick objects that felt relatively traditional, to the point where just like they felt very Victorian vibes, and I was just super happy with the end result of it, to be honest. But yeah, so this is where we have that front entrance living space area, where I wanted to place a small little piano right in the center where we had that huge semicircle glass area, and I just really loved the overall vibe that it gave. And I was kind of struggling with what kind of greenery to use throughout the entire build, because I love incorporating a lot of different like vases and greenery throughout the entire build, but a lot of them in The Sims 4 actually feel relatively modern and very bright, but it doesn't really resemble that Gothic vibe and theme. So I was trying to carefully select what kind of objects I felt looked and felt necessary for this build in particular, but I tried to pick ones that had kind of like a nice muted color scheme, especially for the leaves themselves, to make sure they kind of fit the rest of that dark gloomy vibe that I was trying to go for. And we do actually end up adding a bunch of different walls and decals throughout the entire build as well, to make it feel a little bit more worn down, as well as like trying to make it fit that Halloweeny vibe that I was trying to go for. But yeah, so for the main living space itself, we just house these small little seaters here and there. We ended up using a lot of the seaters as well as the fireplaces, which came from the Bella Goth kit. I'm calling it that because I don't actually remember what the actual kit's name was. I believe believe it had something along the lines of like a sanctuary kit, but I don't actually remember the exact name right now. Especially since Belagoth is pretty much made for a house like this, I feel like it definitely made a lot more sense to just like use a lot of the objects from that kit within this build in particular. But yeah, we also had so much space to the point where I was able to use this really huge detailed coffee table right in the center. I really love how that looks, especially with the rest of the crown sort of like design that we have along the sofa and the armchairs themselves. It definitely felt super fitting. And I also used some of the Storybook Nursery kit armchairs and tables around certain parts of the build as well, because I feel like although I don't really use it quite often, I feel like it made a lot more sense for this build in particular. But yeah, I also really love the design of this fireplace in itself. It just feels super unique and very different from the rest of the ones that we have in the game currently. And I feel like in a very Victorian-esque mansion like this, I feel like it makes a lot more sense to incorporate some sort of library embedded within the living space itself. And I feel like what best would be to just like place it right next to where we have the fireplace and the TV itself. And in case you guys are wondering, the picture frame that I ended up using right above the fireplace is actually a TV, and I really love the combination of that object, especially since it fits that Gothic vibe while also adding modern sort of like technology elements into the build itself. And yeah, just also use this very nice simple, like I believe it's like a two-seater kiss chair or something like that, and I really love how it just ended up looking right next to where we have those two huge archways, which actually lead you into this next space, which is where we have this checkered flooring, which houses the kitchen for this build in particular. And I really love how this kitchen turned out overall, because although we pretty much go for the same color scheme in terms of like the wallpaper throughout the entire build, this part of the build feels super unique. And I feel like the Life and Death expansion pack kitchen pack was definitely made for a build design like this. I just really love how modern yet Gothic it looks, that to the point where it just like fits the vibe that I was trying to go for. I feel like it just worked really nicely with those small little gold accents that we have, especially since I do end up using quite a lot of objects throughout the entire build, not just in the kitchen overall, that have a lot of this gold accent piece to it. And I was super happy with the end result of it. And I also ended up using this tall ventilation sort of unit right in the center of these double oven unit pieces, and I was super happy with that as well, especially since it kind of fit very nicely right in the center of where we had those windows positioned on either side. Tried to make a small little built-in area for the fridge itself, along with adding an island counter right in the center of this kitchen area, since I felt it was relatively spacious and it kind of resembled an open floor plan design, to the point where I just ended up adding some nice little bar stools along with like a sink on top of it, and of course adding a very huge dining table right in the center of where we have this very luxurious open floor plan space. And we ended up going for the dining table that came from the Vampires pack itself, because I just really love how it just fit the rest of the color scheme that we had going across the rest of the build. Because although I feel like a lot of this game incorporates a lot of these traditional modern pieces and stuff like that, there isn't actually a lot of these like specific Gothic or Victorian or like castle like objects, to be honest, that to the point where it's like kind of tricky to decorate to your liking. However, I still was able to find a few pieces that I felt kind of fit the vibe that I was trying to go for. And once again, just like literally just struggling to find small little decorative pieces to place in the center, maybe because it's a design that I'm not used to creating a lot, especially since I focus a lot more on like modern architecture and stuff like that. But I still feel like I was able to capture a lot of that Gothic essence with the objects that I had selected, even though certain parts of it did feel relatively modern, such as the floor chandeliers, which I feel like looked relatively modern, which came from the Life and Death expansion pack. However, I still resorted to using them because I feel like they felt really appropriate with the sort of design that I was trying to go for. And here is actually where we have that indoor swimming pool area, where I wanted to actually make some sort of botanical garden within here initially, but we ended up changing it into like a small little swimming pool area because I feel like it kind of made a lot more sense, especially since it will definitely get used a lot more rather than having like a huge space filled like a bunch of different plants. And especially since I mentioned like a few moments ago with like not finding a lot of like Gothic related like plants and stuff like that, I feel like it wouldn't have really made a lot of sense to just like turn it into like a useless space, but rather just something that felt a little bit more functional and a little bit more like appropriate for a home like this. But yeah, so we're finally moving on into the formal office area that we have towards the backside of the build, and we ended up using some of the objects that came from the Life and Death expansion pack along with the Sanctuary kit, which I feel like works super well together. And I ended up using this really funky and like tall looking office chair along with like using these like armchairs that didn't really make a lot of sense, but I feel like it works super nicely in a cartoonish sort of Gothic style house like this. And it was actually really fun with decorating and like creating this build overall, especially since it really didn't feel like the normal of like creating something that felt super generic or like always like repetitive or the same. I kind of just like pick objects that looked really unique and interesting, to the point where I just felt like it worked super nicely with the rest of the sort of like vibe that I was trying to go for. But yeah, like these really strange looking armchairs definitely made the build feel a little bit more Victorian and a bit more complete, along with adding a lot of these like really detailed looking frames and like glass mirrors and stuff like that throughout the entire build as well. Just like trying to add these small little elements that you probably wouldn't expect within a modern family home, and I really love how it turned out overall. And I also love the idea of stacking these candles on top of the actual windowsill frame itself, because the windows I ended up using towards the backside of this office space, they don't actually have a windowsill slot area, just for the window to actually look visually appealing and 3D. But I feel like elevating specific clutter object pieces like I did with the candle and just like placing it within that small little area definitely just added to that small little realism that I feel like this build definitely needed in order for it to make it feel as complete as possible. But yeah, so finally we're moving on into the public bathroom that we have on the first floor, which is housed within this circular room. And I loved how it turned out, especially since we have those two really huge doors just like leading you into this bathroom. It just feels super grand and luxurious, to be honest. I ended up actually using that door pretty much for all of the rooms on the first floor and the second floor, but it just felt so gargantuan and just like very grand, to be honest, and it just felt very fitting for a Gothic family home like this. And I ended up using some of the objects in particular that I felt kind of fit the vibe that I was trying to go for, such as this very Victorian sort of half mirror right behind where we have the sink unit area, along with using this very modern bathtub that actually came from the Life and Death expansion pack, which feels super modern but yet fits the vibe that I was trying to go for, especially with the mixtures of that gold within it and stuff like that, because it just fits the rest of the color scheme that we have going across the entire build. And I also ended up changing the flooring to this checkered design within the bathroom itself as well, because I feel like it just added a bit of variation to the room rather than having like a really repetitive gray / black tiling throughout the entire home. Just felt a little bit too repetitive for my liking, and I just feel like it definitely did help with like making it stand out a little bit more. And I did also go around the entire interior of the build as well and just added these nice little candle wall sconces as well, because I could just imagine something like that being very prominent within an old Victorian home. So I feel like it kind of makes sense to incorporate it within this build in particular as well. But yeah, so we're finally moving on into the second floor now, which pretty much houses all of the bedrooms that we have for this build overall. And I believe we have around like 5 bedrooms in total, and the one that I'm showcasing currently is the pretty much like the master bedroom of this build overall, which is pretty much situated in the center of that second floor area. And we also have this nice unique sort of like curved room that is kind of exposed within this little like bedroom itself, and that is actually where we turn it into a small little like ensuite area, which I thought was kind of cool, especially for a build like this. Once again, just using some of my favorite bathroom objects when it comes to a Gothic house like this, such as using the one that came from the Life and Death expansion pack, and yeah, just like changing up some of these sink unit pieces as well to other ones that felt relatively appropriate, that has these nice little gold accents to it. Once again, using this very fancy gold toilet as well, because I feel like I never got the chance to really use it, and I feel like it kind of made sense to just like use it in a very over the top fancy Gothic house like this. And I really love the overall design that it gave to this build overall. It just makes it feel unique and different. And once again, also placing a bunch of different chandeliers throughout all of the rooms as well. So despite both of these little rooms being embedded into one, I still ended up using different floor tilings and like carpets and stuff like that, just like trying to make it feel as unique as possible despite them being very connected. And yeah, I feel like it turned out super nicely overall, especially with that nice unique color scheme that we have going on. Although it feels relatively tacky with all of these like bright details and textures across the entire build, I feel like it definitely does resemble that traditional vibe that I was trying to go for. And yeah, just like also incorporated a small little dresser area, as well as like this very Victorian looking standalone mirror. And if I am remembering correctly, I believe the bed itself came from the Vampires game pack, but the bedside tables themselves came from the Life and Death expansion pack, in case you guys are wondering. And once again, just using a lot of these gold framed pictures and stuff like that throughout all of the rooms, because I feel like it just fits really nicely with the aesthetic and how it contrasts super nicely with that dark paneling that we have going across all of the walls. But yeah, so we're finally moving on into the nursery that we have for this build, and I was finally able to utilize all of the objects that came from the Storybook Nursery kit, especially since it had that super gothic and dark theme to it. It fits super nicely with this home and the color scheme that I was trying to go for. We do end up changing some of the textures for the wallpapers, however most of it relatively stays the same. And I just love how pretty much every single room throughout all of this build feels so unique yet kind of identical at the same time because of the flooring and the wallpapers being so similar. But I just love the overall end result of this nursery because it just was able to incorporate one of my favorite sort of like designs and color schemes, which is like placing this nursery crib like right in the center where we have that huge window that stares out into the environment. And I just really love just like placing these small little details around it, such as the curtains themselves, and of course using that dresser that came from the Storybook Nursery kit as well. But yeah, so also ended up using the very detailed rocking chair that came from this kit as well off to the side, along with like the bassinet and a small little treasure chest toy thingy as well, which I feel like just made it feel super complete, and I just really love the overall end result of it. And in case you guys are actually wondering, I do actually end up adding some additional high chairs as well as like some like kids toilets and stuff like that throughout the entire build as well, so that you guys don't have to worry about like adding anything that is like missing from this build overall. And yeah, so this is actually the final bedroom that we have within this speed build, and I just really love how it turned out overall, especially since it fits that main red, black, grey color scheme that I had going on initially on the first floor. I just really love how over the top and fancy this Victorian bedroom ended up becoming. It just has that very huge intimidating glass window right in the center of like where we have the room itself opposite the bedroom. It just feels super grand and luxurious, and although the window itself is kind of poking out towards the ceiling and not really like actually making a lot of sense because it kind of merges with the roof above it, it just felt super luxurious, and I really wanted to keep it within this build as it was. And of course using this very tall chandelier, which also came from the Life and Death expansion pack, and once again just added some small little details that you would probably expect within the bedroom itself, such as like a nice small little Gothic dresser which came from the Get Famous expansion pack, and once again using that small love seat off to the side as well, which I just really love the overall look of it, especially with the throwaway blanket on top of it. And once again using that very Gothic looking fireplace with the small little two-seater armchairs, and of course just like added some small little details here and there, such as like some nice little greeneries, as well as like a nice simple coffee table and one of those picture frame TVs, as well as completing it with a nice little fancy rug. And once I was pretty much done with this room, I pretty much went around the entire build overall and just like added some smaller little details throughout the entire hallways, such as like some nice little wall sconces and some additional curtains throughout certain windows that I left out. And there are actually quite a few rooms that I haven't showcased within the speed build, so make sure to stick around towards the end of the video to check out the tour, which pretty much goes throughout all of the rooms, and you guys can pretty much see every single room within this build individually. But yeah, so that is pretty much it for this entire speed build. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think by leaving a like and subscribing, and comment down below your thoughts and suggestions. And I do have a bunch more videos like this on the channel if you guys are interested in builds like these. But thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.